Before we talk about glycolysis, we have to talk about some of the molecules that play such an important role in energy production in the cell. Primary among these is ATP. And if you look at this drawing of ATP, you can see first that it's a nucleotide. It's got a phosphate group, actually three. It's got a nitrogenous base, adenine, and it's got a sugar, ribose. So specifically, this is a ribonucleic acid nucleotide. Also notice that with the three phosphate groups, you've got two wavy bonds that are connecting the last two phosphate groups. These wavy bonds indicate a much higher energy in those bonds. And the reason for that much higher energy is that take a look at the oxygens on the phosphate groups. They've got negative charges, and as I'm sure you remember, negative charges repel one another. So if you were to bring on those last two phosphate groups, bring on one at a time, let's say, if you bring the first one in, you're going to have to apply force to bring that phosphate group and then forge a bond between the first one closest to ribose and the second one. And once you do that, the phosphate groups are going to want to get apart, but they're held together by that bond. If you were to break that bond, that energy would be dispelled, and sort of it would cause something to happen. Now, a story I often tell is that about this to illustrate this fact is: imagine that you are in a grocery store with a young child, and the young child wants to go down the candy aisle. Well, you don't want to take the young child down the candy aisle, because if you do, his energy level will go up more than you can perhaps handle. So what you do is you try to pull him that way, but he won't go. So, and you will make enemies of the grocery store populace by doing this. You can aim your child at a pile of cans, let's say, and aim him in such a way so that when you let go of him, he will hit that pile of cans and knock them over, and perhaps learn a lesson about not going down to the candy aisle when you don't want him to. At any rate, what would happen is you could liken yourself to a negative charge and the child to a negative charge, and when you release that bond holding you together, you're holding his hand, he will go propelled toward that pile of cans and knock it over. That energy that was released by breaking that bond between you and the child can be turned into knocking over that pile of cans. The same thing applies to the third phosphate group when it's added to the second phosphate group. You might notice that there's not a high energy bond when you attach the first one, and that's because there's no negative charge there to repel. So again, whenever you see this wavy bond, it means that there is a high energy bond there that can be used by the cell and can be harnessed by the cell to do work. We also must cover some terminology here. When you have the sugar and the adenine alone, that is a nucleoside. When you add the first phosphate group, that is a nucleotide, and that is adenosine monophosphate, or AMP. When you add the second phosphate group, you've got ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and when you add the third one, you've got ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Keep in mind that the production of ATP from ADP in a phosphate group is an uphill reaction that requires energy. It's not spontaneous, and it's got a positive delta G. That is, it's a positive delta G reaction. On the other hand, the breakdown of ATP, hydrolysis, because water is introduced across the bond, that is a downhill reaction. It is spontaneous, energy is released in the process, and it is a negative delta G reaction. Again, keep in mind that you're breaking down nucleotides. In one case, you're building them up in the other. Breaking them down releases energy. Building them up requires energy. As we will see, there are lots of ATP relatives that are involved in the process of making energy in living cells. This is another one. This is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, NAD, or nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate, NADP, which we're going to see when we talk about photosynthesis. NAD is used in respiration. Usually NAD is used when you're breaking things down, as in respiration. NADP is used when you're building them up, as in photosynthesis. Now, NAD transports energy in a way different from the way that ATP does. ATP does it by the repulsion of the phosphate groups. In nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, what happens there is the nicotinamide nitrogenous base, which is similar to the other nitrogenous bases we've talked about, but that one carries energy by being either reduced or oxidized. Now, when a molecule picks up extra electrons with or without hydrogens, some of them pick up electrons without hydrogens, some pick them up with hydrogens. In this particular case, NAD picks up hydrogens as well. When such a molecule picks up hydrogens and electrons, it is extremely energetic. It's more energetic than it was before. And a molecule like this that's reduced is energetic. Now, how can you remember what reduced and oxidized mean? Well, a molecule that's reduced has picked up extra electrons. And as you might recall, electrons have negative charges. So when you pick up extra electrons, you have picked up extra negative charges, hence your charge is reduced. Oxidized is the opposite of that. When something is oxidized, it has lost electrons, and it has less energy. And that's just the best way to recall this. Or at least it's the way that's worked best for me. So NAD picks up electrons and is more energetic. We'll see other ones that are similar to this. For instance, we'll talk about FAD, which is flavin-adenine dinucleotide, and we'll also see another one, which is coenzyme A, where A stands for adenine. So now, by the way, just as a final reminder here, when we talk about NADP with photosynthesis, what you're going to notice is that the phosphate group is added to the 2' hydroxyl of the ribose sugar that makes up this nucleotide. And you can see it there on the drawing. You can see where it's attached. And that makes this NADP instead of NAD. Now, notice that there are 2 other phosphate groups over there connecting the 2 nucleotides. I should point out that in the old days, these 2 molecules had a different name. NAD was known as diphosphopyridine nucleotide, or DPN, and NADP was known as triphosphopyridine nucleotide, or TPN. And this was back in the old days when I was in college. The name changed since then, and now we use NAD and NADP.